The reading is from Mark M. Muse, Accepting Loss. Transience or impermanence is the name for the insight that is probably easiest to understand. Everyone acknowledges that things change, but the mindfulness tradition contends that most of us fail to acknowledge the depth of change without qualification, and hence we live resisting the impermanence over which we have no control. Even Zen masters have to be reminded of our attachment to objects and how to cope with loss. In a Zen monastery several centuries ago, a young monk accidentally broke his master's treasured antique teacup while cleaning it. When he heard his master's approach, he quickly gathered up the pieces of the cup and put them behind his back. Then he cleverly asked the master, "Sir, why must people die?" Then the novice produced the broken. The master answered, "It's natural. Everything has its finite lifespan, and everything must die." Then the novice produced the broken teacup and told the master, "It was time for your teacup to die."
Okay, I'm going to be reading a passage from 1 Samuel, and this describes a time in the young David's life before he would become the king of Israel. But Saul replied to David, "You cannot go up to fight against this Philistine. You are just a lad, and he has been fighting all his life." David said to Saul, "I am my father's shepherd. Whenever a lion or a bear carries off one of our flock, I go after it, attack it, and rescue the sheep from its jaws. Then if it turns on me and I seize it by its fur, strike it, and then I kill it. I have killed lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will fare no better than they, for this, quote, champion has defied the ranks of the living God. Yahweh, who saved me from the lions and the bears, will save me from this Philistine." "Go then," Saul said, "and may Yahweh go with you." Saul put his own tunic on David, placed a bronze helmet on his head, and gave him a coat of mail to wear. Then Saul fastened his sword on David over the tunic. But David held back, saying, "I can't go in these. I'm not used to them." So David took all of those things off. Then David took up his staff, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the shepherd's bag, which served as his pouch, and with his sling in hand, went out to meet the Philistine.
It's a cold January day. It's the 3rd Sunday of January, and many of the women in the congregation are gone. It must be time for Marilyn and I to dust off our Sunday school clothes and leave the service. Once in a while, I'll get in a discussion with some people, and the discussion might turn to religion. And a lot of talk gets made. Maybe I'll have the opportunity to sort of slide into the conversation the fact that I taught an adult Sunday school for 16 years. And when I do that, there are pretty predictable responses. One of them is, "What? You're no better than we are." I say, so true, so true. I'm no closer to sainthood than I ever was. And sometimes people say, well, how could you stand it? And I respond, well, really, it was a very important experience in my life. But usually people just sort of act like they didn't hear me. Move on. But it's true. It's true. I taught an adult Sunday school class for 16 years. And I learned a lot of lessons while I did that. And it wasn't all Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Diane and I got married about mid-70s, and then we were living here in town, and Diane started going to church. I'd stay home and work on a painting, wondering what was for dinner. She'd come home, and she'd usually come home and say, you know what, there's a Sunday school class that I go to, and I think you'd like it. And I said, sure, yeah, well, I'll put that on the to-do list there, honey. Then time went by, we had a child, and now there's a baby in the house. And now I'm in charge of the baby for 3 hours on Sunday morning as Diane goes to church. And Diane offers again and says, well, you could go to Sunday school and church with me, and we could put the baby in the nursery at that time. And I said, sold. So I went with Diane to this first Sunday school, and I'm in a room, and there are 8 church ladies in there, and Diane and me. Now, don't be offended by the idea of church ladies. I completely understand how that sounds. But back then, 40 years ago, that's what it seemed to me. They were church ladies. They were all about the same age that I am now. So we're sitting around, and the minister's in charge, and we were reading Samuel, the story of David. And doggone if it wasn't interesting. It was very interesting. The selection that Marilyn read this morning about David getting prepared for battle before he goes out to meet Goliath. It was amazing how much I didn't know about the Bible. And it was amazing how interesting it was. That was my first lesson. The Bible is actually a pretty interesting document. You kind of have to cherry pick your way through it. It isn't all interesting, but, there's some great stories in there. The minister was on board for about 2 weeks. Then the leadership of the class, the new teacher, came aboard, and he was an executive for Western Publishing, and I'm sure he was a very important man, and I'm sure that he was a terrific executive for Western Publishing. But teaching is kind of its own thing, and he had some problems, and I felt I had to be there to throw out a few softballs, keep the machine, keep it rolling, About the 4th time that I went to class, I left the room, and the minister and the new teacher, Chuck was his name, were waiting for me with the Cokesbury book, which was the teacher's manual. And the minister said, you're in charge of this class now. Now I wanted to say, wait a minute. I just got here. I'm not religious. I don't know anything about the Bible. And these women, they know everything. There was something about the way this particular minister asked you to do something, where he wasn't exactly asking you. He was kind of telling you what your new fate would be. So he gave me the Cokesbury manual, teacher's manual. And Cokesbury, anybody, does that ring a bell with anybody? Anybody have any? Yes? I got one, yes. Cokesbury, they were like little booklets. And written to about an 8th grade level. And they were interesting, and they sort of guided you through, different passages different books of the Bible. So I spent the week completely mystified and completely terrified. And I read the teacher's manual, and it told me stuff I was supposed to be teaching. me teaching these ladies. The Bible and religion had been the bedrock of their life, their entire life. So what am I going to teach them? So I looked at the manual, and I said, and it said things like, please teach your class that God's love is always with us and never failing. So I think I got the bright idea just before class started, my first class. I said, I'll throw this out there and see what they think. See if they actually talk. So we read our Bible passages, and then I read what I was supposed to be teaching them. You know, I said, it says here in this book that God's love endures, and that He's with you all the time. How's that been working for you? Is that true in your life? And son of a gun, they started talking. They started talking with each other. They started talking to me. Now, part of this was they were trying to convert me. But things became lively. We had nice discussions. I really came to respect those women. They had lived lives. They had had children die. They'd had divorces. They'd had husbands die. They'd lived a life. And this religion, which I knew nothing of, was a great support to them through their life. And I respected that. And they respected me. And we had discussions. And we listened to each other. And personalities started emerging. I remember Harriet was so proud of the fact that she could be the rebel every week, you know. Harriet would say, hey, you know what? I'm not like these other people. I don't believe that there's a hell. And then, you know, that would bring out a little argument here and there. But, you know, it was a collegial feeling. And I respected them, and I began to understand the vocabulary of religion, and I liked it. Then one day, I was talking to the class about how there were some gay people in my school who were being prejudiced against, and how unfair that was. And I'll never forget one of my favorite church ladies, Dorothy, with her crackly voice, said, well, Jerry, all those homosexuals are going to hell. Well, that didn't sit very well with me, to tell you the truth. So there was sort of there was a pretty big kerfuffle in the Sunday school classroom that day, and such a kerfuffle that calls got made and gossip got spread. And the next week, the minister was sitting there in our class, came in as sort of to officiate, you know. And as Diane remembers, I don't remember, but as Diane remembers, what the minister said was God loves all people. God loves all people, unqualified. So the minister hung around in that class. Then the minister came to the next class, and I thought, well, he's here to, you know, officiate. He's here to make sure nobody gets angry or disrespectful. And after that second time, Diane and I went to the service, and the minister was saying, there's a thing called theology. And it's a study of God and how God affects human life. And there's a theological discussion going on here every Sunday morning. And it's over in Jerry Belland's classroom. And I encourage you to go to that class. And he did this a couple of times. He encouraged people to go to this class. And so the population of the class started to change. A different clientele. The suit and tie guys were coming to class. One of the first suit and tie guys was somebody in Johnson Wax who also had a daughter in one of my art classes, and the daughter was a rebellious, very rebellious type. One of these girls was shaved, the one side of her head, that kind of thing. And I got along fine with her, and she had a nice, she was having a nice experience in class. And I think that he showed up to my class just to see what was this guy. But anyway, he started showing up with his wife and got caught up in the spirit of things. He's discussing things right along with everybody else. And then more suit and tie guys started showing up. Executives from Case and their wives. And it was very cross-cultural. You had the housewife who had just graduated from high school 50 years ago, and you had this magnate of industry in the same room, talking about the same things. And everybody was still listening to each other. And it was a beautiful thing. But what I did learn from Dorothy and her condemnation was you just don't know what people are thinking. It was a lesson that I have to learn over and over again. Sometimes, I feel like the people that I get along with have the same opinions and the same views I do, but that isn't necessarily true. And maybe it's not necessarily even important. We have to be a little, I learned tolerance, okay? Well, we went through a number of Cokesbury books, and I kind of got tired of those. I think we might have gone through all of them, I don't know. And then we did some videotape things, and Diane had given me, she went to a rummage sale once, and she got a book by Carl Jung called Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which was an autobiography. And she put it over I was watching a football game. She handed it to me and said, I think you ought to read this. And I took it as a challenge, and I did read it. And I learned a lot about Carl Jung, who is one of those geniuses who changed who made the modern world, actually, at the turn of the 20th century. In the early 1900s, there was just a lot of activity going on. You might call him an early psychologist. His ideas and his thoughts are so much a part of our life that we don't even know they're there. He came up with the term extrovert and introvert, for instance. Those are words invented by Carl Jung to describe different personality types. And I told the minister, I want to try teaching this book, just to see what will happen. And if it fails, it fails. And, this was a radical departure to do something outside of the Bible. So there was a meeting, and people said, well, we'll give it a try. We'll try it once and see what happens. Well, the Jung class turned out beautifully. People started coming, and there were lieutenants in the class. Part of the success of this class was there was a group of people, mainly suit and tie people, who were interested in having the class succeed and who were getting something out of it, and who were showing up every week. There was also an ex-minister who showed up. There was an arts advocate who showed up, a woman who didn't go to the church, but who wanted to go to this class. And so part of the class was people who didn't go to the church. Well, they started going to the church after a while and bringing their children or grandchildren. And the class was actually helping grow the church at that point. And we achieved a kind of group mind where it took a little while to get there, but we'd start with reading, and I might say, well, did anybody find anything in this passage that they thought about through the week? And that would start something, and we're all listening to each other. We're all listening to each other. We're not coming to any great conclusion, but we're understanding the material a little better, okay? We're understanding where Jung is kind of pointing to. And it was sometimes very difficult. Sometimes we'd get through one paragraph of the book. And I've got, there's that book right there. Battle Worn, Memory, Dreams, and Reflections. It was a good experience. And if you've ever been to a voluntary adult class, you know that usually the class starts out with a certain number, and then you can pretty much count on half of that number being the ones who finish the class, right? In this particular class, we started out with 15 people around the table and ended up with over 30. And they were sitting deep, 3 deep at the end of the table. And I should also say that part of the success of the class was that Jung was a hot topic right at that time. A book came out called Women Who Run with Wolves. There we go, Women Who Run with Wolves. And the author talked quite a bit about Jungian archetypes and that kind of thing. So the class itself accidentally hit a kind of mainstream of thought that people really wanted to explore. One of the nicest compliments I ever got as a teacher was at the end of the final class. There's all these people are sitting around, and somebody said, "We just ought to start this all over and do it again." Thank you for saying that. We didn't do it again. We didn't do Jung again, but we read a lot of stuff, a lot of good stuff. We always had readings. Scott Peck, for instance, Richard Rohr, who you may have heard of, Richard Rohr. They were Christians, but they talked about spirituality in a broader way. Carl Jung felt that man was a spiritual animal. This is what separated him from other species on Earth, that he was truly a spiritual animal. And so we read these books, and I'd say stack of them this high over the next 8 or 9 years. There were some low points and there were some high points. I didn't really understand this at the time completely, but there were people in the church at that time who were not too happy about this class going on. In fact, they were dead set against it. And I guess it was a topic of discussion. I vaguely knew about the disapproval. About once a month, there was a woman who showed up with her checkbook, and she was busy balancing her checkbook and looking around as people were talking. She wasn't going to participate. She just wanted to see what was going on. So we had 8 or 9 good years. I sort of knew that there was some disapproval going on. And yet, in our little cluster there, in our little group mind, everything was fine. Well, then it was over. The class was over. It took years, but it just fell apart really quickly. Case reorganized, got purchased by a foreign company, and one of my suit and tie guys retired and moved to Arizona. Another executive got a new job in Wheeling, Illinois. The ex-minister, who I kind of counted on to help keep things rolling, went to live in an assisted living in Janesville. The arts advocate, who was a very important part of this, she got sick, and soon died. And all of a sudden, I was left with a room full of people who didn't have the same goals that we used to have. They didn't have the same spirit. They didn't seem to think it was very important to actually read what we were reading. And you know, it was getting harder and harder to start the class, because everybody would bring in photos of their garden or their grandchildren or their dogs or something like that. And then, you know, they wanted to have social time, and I felt like I was swimming upstream. It's a familiar feeling if you're a teacher. But the day I knew that things were really over was the day that I asked people if they'd read something that caught their imagination. And one of the women in the class, who was really an important woman in the church, said, "You don't expect us to read this stuff, do you?" Yeah. Well, I finished out the session, the year, and I said, it's kind of over. I'm quitting, and there wasn't a whole lot of tears about that. There wasn't a whole lot of. There wasn't a big parade saying Jerry's quitting teaching. There wasn't a plaque with my name on it. You know, if I was expecting any applause, well, forget it. You know. So I quit, and I have to say that not having that class left a huge hole in my life. It had become sort of a spiritual journey for me, that class, and to not have that group thing, it just. And then on top of that, you know, now I don't have this barrier of this class, and I really started understanding that the church had changed. The church had changed quite a bit. There were more fundamentalists in the congregation. The whole atmosphere had changed. The minister that had asked me to do the Sunday school, he was long gone. There had been four ministers in the time that we had that class. Each of them sort of kicked out by the church, or, you know, unsatisfactory. And those ministers would come in, and they didn't know what the heck was going on in that room, and they didn't want to find out, and, you know, they just didn't have any interest in it. And I found that in the congregation in general, if I wanted to speak up about anything, my voice felt very unwelcome. I felt kind of shunned, is the word, I believe. I felt like no one wanted to hear what I wanted to say, and they were kind of glad that class that I had was over. That was hard to take. That was hard to take, really. And once in a while, I had an acquaintance who started a kind of a Bible study thing. And, obviously, it wasn't the same thing. I remember I voiced one of my fine opinions, and after the class was over, this woman whom I'd never seen before came up to me and said, do you really feel the way you said about blah, blah, blah? I said, yeah. And she says, I feel sorry for you. Well, it got to the point where I quit going to church. Then Diane had sort of an issue with a minister, and then she wanted to quit the church, and so Diane Christensen had talked to Diane about this church that met in a country club. I said, that sounds about right. Let's go to the country club church. You know? So I came here to Sacred Journeys, and with Diane, and I think the big thing I learned was the importance of just congregating, of being together. Sunday was a day again where I could see familiar faces. Even though I might not know their names, here we were. We decided we were going to show up in this place. And there was an attempt at being transcendental, that life was more than your checkbook, more than your car, that there was a spiritual aspect to our life. And so we get together, we sing songs, we have our joys and concerns. Kids come up, usually. Then I get a charge out of that. Just seeing, you can watch them grow, I've been here 10, 11 years. It's fun to watch, like, little Ireland grow into this preteen, Listen to the sermon. Some days the sermons will change your life, and some days you forget what the sermon was by the time you get home. But what was important was the meeting. What was important was being together. And I thank this congregation for this. I ran this by my daughter in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I told her the basic outline of what I was going to say. And she said, "Well, Dad, you sound so jaded." And I said, what I really wanted to sound like, I wanted to sound hopeful. Because, there is something about coming together. Look at this, all these decisions here to get up and be here. As a conclusion, I'm going to read the words of a verse of the song we sing often for when we pass the collection plate for offering. Oh, we give thanks for this fellowship, whether near or far, we're blessed by it. For the bonds we share with love and care, oh, we give thanks for this fellowship. Change is just part of life. It was time for that class to die. It was time to move on to the next chapter. Thanks for being part of that. Amen.